human stepped into the domed enclosure, and the Tarkalian guards leveled their pulse rifles at his head, fingers twitching on the triggers, making it clear that humans weren't just banned from the Tarkalian intergalactic zoo, they were barely tolerated inside it. Tensions between humans and Tarkalians had always run high. The Tarkalians viewed themselves as superior in every way, and saw humans as a dangerous, primitive species that needed to be contained. So it was a surprise to everyone when the Tarkalian government agreed to allow a human diplomat, Scott Crawford, to tour their most prized facility, the Intergalactic Zoo. The zoo was a marvel of alien engineering and bioscience. Colossal transparent domes enclosed meticulously recreated ecosystems from 100 different worlds, housing the rarest creatures from across the galaxy. Anti-grav walkways wound between the habitats, offering visitors unparalleled views of the captive species in their natural environments. Scott's Tarkalian liaison, a haughty official named Boron, led him through the zoo, boasting about how the facility's purpose was to preserve and study lesser species. But as the tour went on, Scott noticed some disturbing signs. Many of the animals appeared apathetic and unhealthy, lying listlessly in their enclosures. Boron dismissed Scott's concerns with a condescending wave of his hand. In the research labs, things were even worse. Scott watched, appalled, as alien creatures were subjected to invasive experiments and kept in sterile isolation cages that looked nothing like their natural habitats. He realized the Tarkalians weren't interested in conservation at all, only in exploiting these rare species for their own scientific gain. Scott's horror only grew when Boron mentioned the zoo's upcoming plans to acquire some human specimens. "It's for research and conservation, of course," Boron said, mandibles clicking. "Your species won't be around for much longer, I'm afraid. You'll drive yourselves extinct soon enough." But Scott could read between the lines. To the Tarkalians, humans were just the next primitive species to be collected, studied, and subjugated. Knowing he had to stop this, Scott began secretly recording evidence of the zoo's unethical practices on his neural implant, determined to expose the depths of the Tarkalians' arrogance and cruelty to the galaxy. He never imagined he'd soon be fighting for his life as the zoo descended into pandemonium around him. A containment failure in the carnivore wing sent monstrous creatures rampaging through the domes, and in the chaos, Scott saw an opportunity. Not only did he have a chance to save humanity from the Tarkalians' plot, but to free all the aliens they had enslaved. Scott knew attempting this alone, without any backup, was practically a suicide mission. He also knew it would likely get humans banned from Tarkalian space for good. But if he succeeded, he could end the Tarkalians' campaign of exploitation for 100 species. With alarms shrieking and alien beasts on the loose, Scott set his desperate plan in motion, praying that human ingenuity and grit would be enough to prevail against this cosmic injustice. The fate of entire civilizations was now in one human's hands as creatures bellowed and Tarkalian pulse rifles took aim. Scott's fingers flew over his neural implant interface as the chaos erupted around him. Alarms shrieked and creatures roared as he hacked into the zoo's security system, overriding containment protocols with a flurry of mental commands. Habitat doors slid open, unleashing a torrent of alien beasts into the pristine walkways and viewing areas. Scott raced through the mayhem, his heart pounding, dodging panicked visitors and enraged animals. An insectoid behemoth the size of a shuttle barreled past, mandibles clicking, nearly trampling him as it smashed through a decorative fountain. Venomous serpents coiled around anti-grav railings, hissing and spitting at fleeing Tarkalians. The once meticulously crafted zoo was rapidly devolving into a hellscape of shattered glass, twisted metal, and rampaging creatures. But to Scott, it was a thing of beauty. Each habitat he breached, each research lab he ransacked, was a blow against Tarkalian cruelty and arrogance. Suddenly, a child's scream pierced through the din. Scott whirled to see a group of human schoolchildren cowering in an alcove off the main walkway, their chaperones nowhere to be seen. A pack of snarling, six-legged predators was advancing on them, fangs bared. Scott charged forward, scooping up a fallen pulse rifle from a mauled Tarkalian guard. He aimed it at the predators and squeezed the trigger, sending a crackling beam of energy into their midst. The beasts scattered with yelps of pain and fear. "Come on!" Scott yelled to the terrified children, herding them down the walkway. He spotted a maintenance door, hacked it open with a mental command, and hustled the kids inside. They huddled together, whimpering as Scott sealed the door behind them. "It's okay, you're safe now," he assured them, kneeling down to their level. "I'm going to get you out of here. I just need to disable the security system first. Stay put and don't open this door for anyone, understand?" The children nodded mutely, eyes wide with fear and awe. Scott gave them a reassuring smile and slipped back out into the chaos, locking the door securely behind him. He fought his way through the pandemonium to the zoo's central control room, following the route he'd memorized from Boron's tour. When he burst inside, he found the Tarkalian and a gaggle of scientists frantically trying to regain control of their systems. "You!" Boron snarled when he saw Scott, his eye stalks swiveling with rage. "You did this! You've sabotaged everything!" Scott met his accusation with a defiant glare. "No, I'm setting things right. You're the ones who've been sabotaging the rights of sentient species across the galaxy." He tapped his neural implant, projecting the secret recordings he'd made of the Tarkalians' cruel experiments and callous exploitation. Boron and the scientists recoiled as the damning images played out before them. "It's over, Boron," Scott declared. "Release all the creatures you've imprisoned here and end your unethical research. Now." Boron's mandibles clacked with contempt. "You dare lecture us? We are centuries beyond you in science and technology. That gives us the right, no, the obligation, to study and exploit lesser species as we see fit. Sentience is what grants a species rights, not how advanced their tools are." Scott shot back. "What you're doing here is monstrous. It's slavery, torture, and abuse on a cosmic scale." As the human and Tarkalian argued, the far wall suddenly exploded inward with a tremendous crash. An enormous alien predator burst into the room, all claws and fangs and fury. Boron and the scientists screamed in terror and fled out a side door, leaving Scott alone with the beast. Heart in his throat, Scott grabbed a length of broken conduit from the wreckage of a computer bank. As the predator lunged for him, he sidestepped and brought the makeshift club down on its skull with all his strength. The creature crumpled to the floor, dazed. Knowing he had precious little time, Scott leaped over the beast's twitching form and stabbed commands into the room's few functioning interfaces. A few quick hacks and he'd initiated a full evacuation alert and containment release. Warnings blared through the zoo, urging all visitors to flee to escape pods immediately. The remaining habitats clicked open, the last of the captives finally freed. Scott pelted back through the crumbling zoo to the maintenance room where he'd left the children. Pulse rifle in hand, he blasted and battered his way through the gauntlet of panicked creatures and collapsing walkways. Electrified creepers lashed at his legs. A pack of feline predators nearly eviscerated him. A swarm of razor-winged flyers sliced at any exposed skin. But Scott fought through it all with gritted teeth and pure adrenaline. He reached the children and hustled them out, shielding them with his own body. Together they dodged and scrambled their way to the escape pod bay, following the last stragglers of fleeing visitors. Scott practically threw the kids into a pod, then stood guard as the remaining Tarkalians and tourists piled in. Only once the last civilian was aboard did he back into a pod himself, sealing the hatch and slamming the launch button. The pod blasted free of the crumbling zoo, rockets flaring. As Scott watched through a viewport, the Tarkalian Intergalactic Zoo receded into the distance, now a hellish tangle of broken domes, ruined habitats, and rampaging creatures left to sort out the new pecking order. Smoke billowed and flames danced across the wreckage. The once proud symbol of Tarkalian superiority and scientific might was now a monument to their hubris and cruelty. Slumping wearily onto a bench in the escape pod, Scott knew his actions that day would have immense repercussions. He'd struck a crippling blow against the Tarkalians' exploitation of sentient species and exposed their hypocrisy to the galaxy. but he'd also ensured that no human would likely be allowed within 100 light-years of Tarkalian space ever again. And this was only the beginning. With the evidence he'd recorded, Scott was ready to take the fight to the galactic stage, to show that human ingenuity, audacity, and moral grit could challenge even the most technologically advanced alien powers. The war for the galaxy's conscience had begun, and Scott had just fired the first shot. Scott Crawford stood before the towering spires of Alorius Prime, his heart racing. The hope of the universe rested on his shoulders as he prepared to face the Alorian High Council. He strode into the Grand Chamber, the crystalline walls pulsing with energy. The council members, tall beings with iridescent skin, regarded him coldly from their floating thrones. "Esteemed council," Scott began, his voice echoing, "I come before you with grave news." He activated his holoprojector, filling the air with images of Tarkalian atrocities. Gasps echoed through the chamber as Scott revealed the depths of their cruelty. "If left unchecked, the Tarkalians will subjugate us all," Scott warned. "We need your advanced fleet to stop them." The head counselor's eyes narrowed. "Alorius does not meddle in off-world affairs. Your request is denied." Scott's fists clenched. He'd anticipated this. With a deep breath, he played his trump card. "I'm afraid I can't take no for an answer." Scott tapped his neural implant, bringing up streams of Alorian code. "I've uploaded a virus into your planetary systems. Join us, or watch your world crumble." Outrage erupted. Guards leveled weapons at Scott's head, but the head counselor raised a hand, silencing the room. "You dare threaten us?" he hissed. "I dare to rescue the star systems," Scott shot back, "even from itself." Tense minutes passed as the counselors conferred. Finally, the head counselor spoke. "Your audacity is impressive. We will join your coalition." Scott allowed himself a small smile. One world down, many to go. His next stop brought him to the Kraxorian asteroid belt. Massive warships drifted between chunks of space rock, each jam packed with weaponry. Scott's tiny shuttle was dwarfed as it docked with the lead vessel. Inside, he faced a circle of scarred, hulking warriors. Their leader, Chief Grokthar, loomed over Scott. "You've got nerve, human," Grokthar rumbled, "coming here to ask for our help." Scott met his gaze unflinchingly. "I need the best, and everyone knows that's the Kraxorians." A low chuckle rippled through the group. Scott pressed on, recounting his daring escape from the Tarkalian zoo. As he spoke, he saw grudging respect dawning in their eyes. "We'll fight," Grokthar declared, "for the right price." Scott nodded. "Name it." The negotiations were brutal, but in the end, the Kraxorians pledged their forces. On the insectoid world of Zilrian, Scott faced his strangest audience yet. The Hive Queen towered over him, her multifaceted eyes unblinking. "Vengeance," she clicked. "Yes, we will join. Our bioships and drones are yours." But as Scott turned to leave, she added, "For a price, worlds. We demand new territories." Scott hesitated. It wasn't his to give, but he needed the Zilrians. "I'll see what I can do." As word of the growing alliance spread, Scott found himself besieged by offers from the galaxy's underbelly. Pirate kings and crime lords pledged their support in exchange for pardons and profit. It was on Stellarian Station that disaster nearly struck. Scott was crossing a crowded plaza when blaster fire erupted. He dove behind a pillar as energy bolts sizzled past. A gravelly voice shouted, "Move!" A blue-skinned alien tackled Scott, dragging him to cover as more shots peppered the area. "Mavrin Loek," the alien grunted, returning fire. "Bounty hunter, and it seems you need one." Together they fought their way to safety. Mavrin explained the attackers were Tarkalian assassins, out to stop the alliance before it fully formed. "I'll be your bodyguard," Mavrin offered, "for a price." Scott sighed. "Always a price. What do you want?" Mavrin's eyes glinted. "The Zilrian concessions, whatever they are." As Scott continued his whirlwind tour of the galaxy, Reports flooded in of Tarkalian strikes against allied worlds. The coalition was taking shape, but cracks were already forming. Species bickered over command structures and resource allocation. Old grudges threatened to reignite. Scott rubbed his temples, reviewing the latest batch of demands from coalition members. Somehow, he had to forge this ragtag group into a unified force capable of stopping the Tarkalian war machine. All while dodging assassins, managing egos, and trying not to start a dozen new wars in the process. The real battle, he realized, was just beginning. The acrid stench of burning metal and plasma discharge assaulted Scott's nostrils as he stepped off the shuttle onto Kravos 3's ravaged surface. Mavrin Loek flanked him, blaster at the ready, as Trillian bodyguards fanned out to secure the area. "This way," Mavrin growled, gesturing toward a gutted factory complex. Distant explosions punctuated the air, and Scott could see pillars of smoke rising from multiple sectors of the sprawling industrial cityscape. They picked their way through debris-strewn streets, passing the charred husks of overturned vehicles and the occasional body. Scott's teeth clenched at the sight of a dead Kravosian worker. Her 4 arms splayed lifelessly across the rubble. "Contact!" a Trellian guard hissed, raising his weapon. A group of armed Kravosians emerged from a side alley, leveling makeshift guns at Scott's party. "We're not here to fight," Scott called out, raising his hands. "I'm Scott Crawford, here to negotiate on behalf of the Alliance." The Kravosian leader, distinguishable by a red armband, stepped forward. "Negotiate? While your Kraxorian dogs slaughter us in the streets?" "The Kraxorians have overstepped," Scott replied firmly. "I'm here to put a stop to it." Before the Kravosian could respond, the whine of engines filled the air. A Kraxorian gunship swooped low, strafing the street with plasma fire. Scott and his team dove for cover as the Kravosians scattered. "This ends now," Scott snarled, tapping his communicator. "Get me the Kraxorian warlord immediately." Minutes later, Scott stood face-to-face with Grok Thar, the hulking Kraxorian commander. They met in a hastily secured command post, the sounds of battle echoing in the distance. "You promised us this world, human," Grok Thar rumbled, towering over Scott. "Its resources, its people, all ours to use as we see fit." Scott's eyes narrowed. "I promised you payment for your services, not slaves. Stand down your forces and withdraw from Kravos 3. Grok Thar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what? You need us, Crawford. Without my warriors, your pitiful alliance stands no chance against the Tarkalians." "Then you leave me no choice," Scott said quietly. He nodded to Mavrin, who swiftly drew his blaster and fired. The stun bolt caught Grok Thar square in the chest, dropping the massive alien to the floor. Scott leaned in close to the paralyzed warlord. "Here's what happens next. You order your troops to stand down, or I'll have you executed for war crimes against the Kravosians. Your choice." Grok Thar's eyes bulged with rage, but he remained silent. Scott straightened, addressing the room. "Broadcast this to all Kraxorian forces on Kravos III. You have 1 hour to lay down your weapons and withdraw to your ships. Anyone still engaged in hostilities after that time will be considered an enemy of the Alliance and dealt with accordingly." The next hour passed in tense silence. Scott watched from a command center as Kraxorian units gradually disengaged, falling back to their landing zones. A few pockets of resistance remained, but without central leadership, they quickly crumbled. As the last Kraxorian ships lifted off, Scott turned to the assembled Kravosian leaders. "Your world is yours again," he said solemnly. "We'll provide aid and resources to rebuild. In return, I ask that you resume production for the Alliance as soon as possible. The Tarkalian threat looms large, and we need every ship, every weapon you can produce." The Kravosians agreed, albeit warily. Scott spent the next few days overseeing the formation of a new planetary government and the resumption of critical manufacturing operations. But even as he worked to stabilize Kravos III, his mind raced with the implications of what had transpired. Back aboard his flagship, Scott called an emergency meeting of the Alliance leadership. Representatives from a dozen species crowded into the conference room, tensions palpable. "What happened on Kravos 3 cannot be repeated," Scott began, his voice firm. "We face an existential threat from the Tarkalians. If we're to have any hope of victory, we must be united. No more internal conflicts, no more exploitation of allied worlds." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To that end, I propose the creation of a unified command structure, one voice to coordinate our efforts, to ensure we're all working toward the same goal." Murmurs filled the room, and a Lorian counselor spoke up. "And who would lead this unified command?" Scott took a deep breath. "If you'll have me, I'm willing to take on that responsibility." A hush fell over the assembled leaders. Then, one by one, they began to nod. Within the hour, Scott found himself officially appointed as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces. As the meeting adjourned, Scott stood alone at the viewport, gazing out at the stars. The weight of his new role pressed down on him, a galaxy's worth of lives now depending on his decisions. In the distance, he could see the faint flashes of Tarkalian ships dropping out of hyperspace. Their invasion fleet grew larger by the day. Scott's hand tightened on the railing. The real war was about to begin. Scott's eyes locked onto the tactical display as the Allied armada surged toward Kryler 7. Hundreds of ships, a patchwork fleet cobbled together from a dozen species, moved as one. "All units, commence attack," Scott ordered, his voice steady despite the weight of command. The space around Kryler 7 erupted in chaos. Alorian cruisers unleashed salvos of energy beams, while Kraxorian warships charged headlong into the fray. Zilrian bioships swarmed like insects, overwhelming Tarkalian point defenses. As the battle raged, Scott slipped away with his strike team. Their stealth ship, a sleek Zilrian design that seemed to bend light around its hull, glided silently through Tarkalian space. "Approaching Tarthos Prime," the insectoid pilot clicked. "No sign of detection." Scott nodded, turning to address his team. Mavrin Loek stood at his side, his blue skin gleaming in the dim light. "This is it. We hit hard. We hit fast. Stick to the plan." They touched down on Tarthos's barren surface under cover of darkness. Scott's boots crunched on rocky soil as he led the charge toward a concealed entrance. Trellian commandos fanned out, weapons at the ready. The facility's first line of defense emerged, hovering drones filled with weapons. Scott dove behind a boulder as energy bolts sizzled past. He heard Mavren curse, then the staccato of return fire. "Push forward!" Scott shouted, vaulting over his cover. He sprinted toward the entrance, blasting 2 drones out of the air. The rest of the team followed, a Kraxorian warrior barreling through the reinforced door with raw strength. Inside, they fought their way through corridors teeming with Tarkalian shock troops. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and burned flesh. Scott's armor took hits, the material growing hot against his skin. They reached the main lab complex, and Scott's blood ran cold. Rows of tanks lined the walls, each containing a twisted mockery of life. He saw human limbs fused with alien carapaces, writhing masses of tentacles sprouting from recognizable torsos. "By the stars," Mavrin breathed, his usual bravado faltering. Scott shook off his revulsion. "Plant the charges! We're ending this!" As his team worked, Scott accessed a nearby console. His fingers flew across the alien interface, uploading the virus they'd prepared. Alarms blared, and the facility shuddered. "Time to go!" Scott yelled. They fought their way back, Tarkalian reinforcements closing in. A group of elite guards blocked their path to freedom. Scott watched in horror as Mavrin and his Trellian commandos charged forward. "Go!" Mavrin shouted, trading fire with the guards. "We'll hold them off." Scott hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty. But the choice was made for him as the facility rocked with explosions. He sprinted for the exit, the screams of his comrades echoing behind him. The Kravosian escape pod barely cleared the atmosphere as Tarthos Prime erupted in a blinding flash. Scott stared out the viewport, his victory tasting like ashes in his mouth. As he rendezvoused with the Allied fleet, Scott's communicator crackled to life. Reports flooded in. The shipyards at Kryler 7 in ruins, Tarkalian forces in disarray, a resounding victory for the Alliance. But all Scott could see were the faces of those he'd left behind. He'd won the battle, but at what cost? And how many more would he have to sacrifice before this war was won? Scott Crawford stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Intrepid, his eyes fixed on the holographic display of the Korbor system. The massive Allied fleet hung in space around him, a testament to the Coalition's growing strength. But Scott knew the price paid for this moment. The faces of those lost on Tarthos Prime still haunted his dreams. "Sir, Tarkalian forces detected on approach," a Zilrian sensor officer chittered. "Multiple carrier groups launching combat drones." Scott nodded grimly. "All ships, battle stations, Zilrian carriers, prepare to launch countermeasures." The void erupted in a dazzling light show as energy weapons crisscrossed space. Tarkalian warships unleashed swarms of robotic fighters, their cold efficiency a stark contrast to the bioengineered horrors Scott had faced before. "Incoming!" an officer shouted. Scott braced himself as the Intrepid shuddered under enemy fire. He watched Elorian cruisers return devastating salvos, their beams carving through Tarkalian shields. "Sir, ground assault teams ready for deployment," his XO reported. "Launch!" Scott ordered, striding toward the hangar bay. "I'm going in with the first wave." Minutes later, Scott's dropship plunged through Korbor 7's atmospheric defenses. Acrid fumes seeped through his envirosuit as they touched down amidst towering refineries. The strike team fanned out, weapons at the ready. A hail of plasma fire erupted from Tarkalian defensive positions. Scott dove behind a smelting vat, the metal still hot beneath his gloved hands. He popped up, returning fire and dropping 2 enemy soldiers. "Push forward!" Scott shouted, leading the charge. His multi-species team advanced, a Kraxorian warrior smashing through a barricade with raw strength. They fought their way deeper into the facility, freeing groups of enslaved laborers as they went. Many joined their ranks, their eyes burning with vengeance. "We know the layout," a freed Elorian worker said. "The main control center is this way." Scott nodded, gesturing for the team to follow. They battled through corridors thick with toxic fumes, Tarkalian security forces growing more desperate with each encounter. Finally, they reached the central hub. Scott planted breaching charges on the reinforced door. The explosion rocked the facility, and they stormed in, guns blazing. When the smoke cleared, Scott stood over the Tarkalian commander, his weapon trained on the alien's head. "Surrender," Scott growled. "It's over." Hours later, as coalition ships secured orbit and reinforcements poured in, Scott received an urgent communique. His blood ran cold as he read the intercepted Tarkalian transmission. "Sir," his security chief said, "we've tightened protocols, but—" Scott cut him off. "They're coming for me. For all of us." He stared out at the captured refineries, knowing the true battle was just beginning. The mineral wealth of Korbor 7 would fuel their war effort. But at what cost? As he contemplated their next move against the Tarkalian homeworlds, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that his own time was running out. The assassins were coming, and the fate of the entire alliance now hinged on his survival. Scott Crawford stood on the bridge of the Intrepid, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Solrath star cluster loomed before them, a glittering expanse of ancient suns and worlds that had birthed Tarkalian civilization. "All ships prepare for jump," Scott ordered, his voice steady despite the weight of what they were about to attempt. "Commence Operation Sunbreaker." Space warped around them as the massive Allied fleet surged forward. They erupted into normal space amid a storm of weapons fire. Tarkalian border fortresses, caught off guard by the sudden assault, frantically returned fire. Scott watched as Elorian cruisers unleashed devastating energy beams, carving through Tarkalian shields. Kraxorian warships plowed forward, their reinforced hulls shrugging off hits that would have crippled lesser vessels. "Sir, enemy fleet massing near Tarkalia Prime," a sensor officer reported. Scott nodded, a grim smile playing at his lips. "Just as we planned. All ships, press the attack on their orbital shipyards. Make them think that's our primary target. As the main fleet engaged, cloaked stealth ships slipped past the chaos. Scott received coded transmissions from the infiltration teams as they touched down on outer colonies throughout the system. Hours passed in a blur of tactical updates and split-second decisions. Then, amidst the din of battle, a hush fell over the bridge. "Sir," the communications officer said, awe in his voice, "we're getting reports of widespread power failures across Tarkalian space." Scott allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "Signal the invasion force. It's time." The Allied armada surged forward, fresh troops pouring from Mavrin Loic's transport ships. They smashed through the disorganized Tarkalian defenses, capitalizing on the chaos sown by the sabotage teams. Scott's dropship plunged through Tarkalia Prime's atmosphere, the gleaming spires of the capital city rising to meet them. As they touched down, he led the charge out onto streets choked with panicked civilians and confused soldiers. "Push forward," Scott shouted, blasting a Tarkalian guard who raised his weapon. "Secure those government buildings." They fought their way through the city, the once mighty Tarkalian forces crumbling before their advance. Scott watched as Kraxorian warriors smashed through barricades and Zilrian bioships provided air support, raining fire on enemy positions. Days blurred together as they battled block by block, planet by planet. When the dust settled, Scott found himself standing in the opulent throne room of the Tarkalian hierarchy, surrounded by the broken remnants of their leadership. A Tarkalian warlord, his ornate armor scorched and dented, approached with head bowed. "Supreme Commander Crawford," he said, the words clearly bitter on his tongue, "we surrender." Scott accepted the formal capitulation, but his mind was already racing ahead. He could see the cracks forming in his coalition, the hungry look some of his allies cast at the defeated Tarkalians. As he stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the conquered city, Scott knew the real challenge was just beginning. The war might be won, but keeping the peace would require all of his skill and commitment. Scott Crawford stood before the holographic display. His eyes narrowed as he studied the chaotic reports flooding in from across Tarkalia Prime. The taste of victory had quickly soured in his mouth. "Another incident in Sector 7, his aide reported, voice tight. Kraxorian mercenaries raided a Tarkalian settlement. Dozens dead, more taken as slaves. Scott banged his head on the console, the impact echoing through the command center. "This ends now. Get me a direct line to Warlord Krogash." The scarred face of the Kraxorian commander filled the screen, lips pulled back in a snarl. "Crawford, what do you want?" "I want you to rein in your troops, Krogash. This isn't conquest, it's butchery." Krogash barked a harsh laugh. "We took these worlds by force. The spoils are ours by right. You humans are too soft." Scott cut the transmission, fury building in his chest. He turned to his staff. "Prepare my shuttle. We're going planetside." Hours later, Scott walked through the smoking ruins of a Tarkalian city. The stench of death filled his nostrils as he saw bodies strewn in the streets, alien and human alike. A group of Kraxorian soldiers lounged nearby, their armor stained with blood. "You there!" Scott shouted, striding towards them. "Who's in command here?" The soldiers scrambled to attention, recognizing the Supreme Commander. One of them stepped forward, mandibles clicking nervously. "Sir, we—" A deafening explosion rocked the street. Scott was thrown to the ground, ears ringing. He looked up to see a Tarkalian insurgent team melting back into the ruins, their work done. The Kraxorian soldiers lay dead or dying. As Scott pushed himself to his feet, his calm crackled to life. "Sir, we've got reports of coordinated attacks across 3 sectors, coalition casualties mounting." Scott's mind focused. This couldn't go on. He tapped his comm, voice steely. "All Allied leaders, emergency summit on Vectera. No excuses, no delays." Days later, Scott stood in the grand hall of Vectera's capital, facing down a sea of angry alien faces. Kraxorian warlords, Alorian diplomats, Zilrian hive minds, all clamoring for their piece of the conquered worlds. "Enough!" Scott's voice cut through the din. This infighting ends now. We liberated these worlds to end Tarkalian oppression, not become oppressors ourselves. A Craxorian chieftain pushed forward, teeth bared. Pretty words, human, but we bled for this victory. We'll take what we're owed. Scott met the alien's glare. And you'll have nothing if the Tarkalians rise up and slaughter us all, which is exactly what will happen if we don't get our act together. Tension crackled through the air. Scott could see hands inching towards weapons. He took a deep breath, preparing to make his last-ditch effort. If you can't fall in line, then the coalition leaves. Today, we pull out entirely and leave you to face the Tarkalian insurgency alone. Outrage exploded through the chamber. A Craxorian bodyguard lunged forward, energy blade humming to life. Scott's own guards moved to intercept, weapons raised. The clash of metal on metal rang out as the two sides met. Scott's heart raced as he saw the situation spiraling out of control. This was it, the moment his coalition shattered. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Mavrin Loak strode in, flanked by his elite mercenary squad. The blue-skinned alien's voice boomed across the chamber. Put down your weapons, you idiots. Can't you see you're playing right into the enemy's hands? The room fell silent, all eyes on Mavrin. The mercenary commander fixed the assembled leaders with a withering glare. Crawford's right. United we stand, divided we fall. It's that simple. Scott felt the tide turning. He pressed his advantage. We need to work together, build something lasting here, not just pillage and run. Slowly, grudgingly, the alien leaders nodded their assent. Scott allowed himself a small sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Scott threw himself into the work of rebuilding. He disbanded the worst of the Craxorian units, integrating them into mixed-species task forces. New governing councils were established, with strict oversight to prevent abuses. As Scott walked through a model community where Tarkalians and aliens worked side by side, he dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could forge a new future here. His comm unit buzzed, shattering the moment of peace. Scott's blood ran cold as he listened to the urgent report. Sir, long-range scans are picking up a massive Tarkalian battle group. They're pushing through our outer defenses, heading straight for... Scott Crawford's comm unit crackled with urgent static. He sprinted through the corridors of the command center, boots pounding on metal grates. Breathless, he burst into the tactical room. Report, he barked. Admiral Vexler, a towering Alorian with iridescent scales, pointed to the holo display. Long-range scans picked up a massive enemy force breaching our outer defenses. Scott leaned in, eyes narrowing at the swarm of red indicators. Strength? At least 500 warships, Vexelar replied. And these energy readings, they're off the charts. A human analyst stepped forward, face pale. Sir, we've identified the lead vessel. It's the Apocalypse Fang. Scott's blood ran cold. Gore Wrath. The name hung in the air like a curse. Scott's mind raced, recalling intelligence briefings on the infamous Tarkalian war master who'd refused to surrender. He's coming for Tarkalia Prime, Scott said, voicing what everyone feared. If he punches through. The unfinished thought didn't need completion. Their fragile coalition, the very peace they'd fought so hard to win, would shatter. Scott's fingers flew over the holo controls, assessing their defensive positions. Deploy all available assets to intercept. I want every ship we can spare moved to these choke points. As Allied vessels surged to meet the threat, Scott watched the inevitable clash unfold. The first salvos erupted in silent, deadly blooms across the vast distances of space. Multiple hull breaches on the Craxorian dreadnought Fist of Vengeance, an officer shouted. Scott's mind focused as he saw Allied ships disintegrate under withering fire. Gorrath's fleet unleashed weapons beyond anything they'd encountered before. Lances of blue-white energy sliced through armor seamlessly. Gravitic weapons crushed entire squadrons into compacted debris fields. Sir! A sensor tech's voice cracked with panic. We're detecting biological signatures, dear God. Scott's stomach churned as the readings flashed across his screen. Mutagenic superviruses, weaponized and primed for deployment. Fall back, Scott ordered, hating every word. We can't hold the outer colonies. Regroup at Tarkalia Prime. As the battered coalition forces retreated, Scott's mind raced. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tables on Gorath's technological superiority. Get me Admiral Loek, Scott commanded. We're going to need every dirty trick he knows. The grizzled mercenary's face appeared on screen, scarred features set in a grim mask. I heard. You want to draw them in close? Scott nodded. It's our only shot. We use Tarkalia Prime's defenses as a force multiplier. Make Gorath commit everything. Loek's eyes gleamed with a predator's cunning. A last stand, eh? I like it. My boys will be ready. As Scott coordinated the desperate defense, reports flooded in of Gorath's advance. Entire worlds fell silent, their populations twisted by unholy bioweapons into shrieking abominations. The remnants of the Allied fleet formed up around Tarkalia Prime, a thin line of steel and valor against the oncoming storm. Scott stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the enemy armada fill the sky. All ships, stand ready, he broadcast. For the future of the galaxy, we hold the line here. The first missiles streaked across the void, and hell itself seemed to erupt over Tarkalia Prime.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.